What's up, everybody? Today on Red Dead History, we'll be talking about the Mexican-American War and how it's depicted in Red Dead Revolver and Red Dead Redemption. First, let's start with mentions or scenes of the war in Red Dead Revolver. In a flashback told by Sheriff Bartlett to Red Harlow, Diego and his army fought a pitched battle with the U.S. Cavalry Regiment over a bridge crossing the Rio Grande. He ordered Colonel Darren to prepare the cannons while he and his men held off the first wave personally. After using flares to highlight the enemy's cannons, his artillery knocked out the enemy's artillery support with precise, concentrated fire. When the U.S. cavalrymen continued to assault its position, Diego ordered his men to rig the bridge with dynamite, while he personally fended off the enemy's soldiers. After blowing the bridge and ending the battle, Diego took account of captured prisoners, including one unlucky civilian, Griffin the Prospector. Originally convinced he was a spy and was sent to be executed, Griffin managed to buy his life back from Diego with a promise of gold. Diego realized how he could become the most powerful general in the country with all the gold at his disposal. We will now look at Sheriff Bartlett's entry about Buffalo. Don't know much about the man who calls himself Buffalo. He was a soldier in a U.S. Army company wiped out by General Diego. Survivors like him were forced to work the Bear Mountain mine. I'm not entirely sure if Buffalo fought in the Mexican-American War. I know for a fact he fought in the Civil War, but it is highly unlikely that he fought in the Mexican-American War. There were a few African-American people in the Mexican-American War, as we will see later on, but not too many that were actual soldiers. So it's highly unlikely that he was involved in the Mexican-American War. But this could have been after when Diego was going after army troops still. In General Diego's entry, Sheriff Bartlett wrote, "The first time I saw Diego was almost my last. I was still in the army, and he kicked the stuffing out of my troop and captured the survivors." In Governor Griff's entry, Sheriff Bartlett writes, "I remember the day it all started. The regiment I was in launched an offensive against a renegade general, name of Diego. Things went badly when I was taken prisoner." In the Border Bridge entry, Sheriff Bartlett writes, "A remote bridge over the river was General Diego's favorite smuggling route. The U.S. Army figured it out and sent a regiment to hit Diego with a surprise attack. The plan was to ambush Diego at his most vulnerable, which is when he passed across this narrow bridge, but Diego was ready for it and then some. He blasted us with cannons and then blew the bridge behind us." Now let's talk about the depiction of the war in Red Dead Redemption. Fort Mercer was likely a fort used in the Mexican-American War, as it is near the border with Mexico, and Jake also speculates that the soldiers who previously occupied it eventually abandoned it, because they moved up north to fight Native Americans or quit to become prospectors.
It's been abandoned for years now. Folks say it was built during the Mexican War. All kinds of soldiers around back then.
Why'd they leave?
Well, I ain't entirely sure. I heard they had to go up north to fight Indians, or maybe they got tired of being soldiers and went looking for gold. You know how things is.
Riley's charge could have also been a site used in the Mexican-American War, from the artillery lying around and the name of the location. It's likely a reference to John Patrick Riley, who captained the St. Patrick's Battalion after they deserted and took up arms against the United States Army during the Mexican-American War. The sites of El Presidio and Torquemada may have also been involved in the Mexican-American War. Now that we have covered the depiction in both games, let's do a brief overview of the war and history. We first have to begin by talking about the Texas Revolution. The 1824 Constitution gave rights to the individual Mexican states. It was based on a federal government of sovereign states system. Under this constitution, American settlers in Texas were exempt from any taxes, tariffs, and government services including defense. So the Texans governed themselves. They believed the Constitution guaranteed self-government. One reason Mexico opened up Texas for immigration initially was to have more people settle between Mexico and some of the fierce tribes such as the Comanche, Kiowa, and more, who lived in central and northwest Texas. The idea was to form a buffer between the northern frontier and the more established southern settlements. Most of the immigrants came from the southern United States, and many were slave owners, even though slavery was made illegal in the Constitution. Mexico's official religion was Roman Catholicism, yet the majority of the immigrants were Protestant, which caused more conflict because they did not want to convert. Some of the northern states, such as Texas and New Mexico, felt that they didn't have enough support from the Mexican government, and basically had to defend themselves from different native tribes, such as the Comanche, Navajo, Apache, and Ute. On December 15, 1835, President Santa Anna replaced the 1824 Constitution with a new document known as Las Siete Leyes, or the Seven Laws. These laws changed Mexico away from the federal structure established by the Constitution of 1824, which effectively ended the First Mexican Republic and creating a centralist republic for the country. The citizens of Texas and some other Mexican states did not receive this change well, because they did not want to be centralized under Santa Anna, especially due to them already feeling like they had little to no support from the Mexican government while being taxed from it, and were mainly self-reliant, and the Texas Revolution and later annexation happened as a result. All of these events set the stage for the Mexican-American War. In the 1844 presidential election, James Polk was elected on a platform of expanding U.S. territory to Oregon, California, and Texas by any means. The boundary between Texas and Mexico was being disputed, with Texas and the U.S. saying that it was the Rio Grande, and Mexico claiming it to be the Nueces River. Polk sent a diplomatic mission to Mexico in an attempt to buy the disputed territory, together with California and everything in between for $25 million, which is just equivalent to about $1 billion today. Mexico refused this offer, and Polk sent a group of 80 soldiers across the disputed territory to the Rio Grande, ignoring Mexican demands to withdraw from the territory. The group of soldiers in the area were led by General and later President Zachary Taylor. Mexican forces interpret this as an attack, and fought the U.S. Army on April 25, 1846. This was called the Thornton Affair. On April 30th, after the Thornton Affair, Mexican General Mariano Arista's troops began to cross the Rio Grande. On May 3rd, the troops began to attack the American outpost at Fort Texas. Taylor marched his army of occupation south to stop the siege. When he learned of his approach, Arista diverted many of his units away from the siege to meet Taylor's force. The battle took place on May 8th, 3 days before the formal declaration of war on Mexico by the United States. The following day, Arista's army is defeated by Taylor's forces, and is pushed back to the town of Matamoros in the battle Resaca de la Palma. Polk then used these series of conflicts to convince the Congress of the United States to declare war on Mexico. The cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before the recent information from the frontier of the Del Norte, but now after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon the American soil. She has now proclaimed that the hostilities have commenced, and that the two nations are now at war. James Polk quote. Several notable people were against this war, such as later President Abraham Lincoln, former President John Quincy Adams, and Frederick Douglass. By May 18th, the United States forces eventually occupied the town of Matamoros. On June 14th, 1846, the Bear Flag Revolt occurred. Though controlled by Mexico, California was home to a growing population of American settlers. Mexican leaders worried that many of these settlers were not truly interested in becoming Mexican citizens, and would push for annexation of California to the United States. For their part, the Americans distrusted their Mexican leaders. When rumors of an impending war between the United States and Mexico reached California, many Americans feared that Mexicans might take a preemptive attack to stop any rebellion. The party of more than 30 Americans under the leadership of William Ide and Ezekiel Merritt invaded the largely defenseless Mexican outpost of Sonoma, just north of San Francisco. Having won a bloodless victory at Sonoma, Ide and Merritt then proceeded to declare California an independent republic. With a cotton sheet and some red paint, they constructed a makeshift flag with a crude drawing of a grizzly bear and a lone red star, a reference to the earlier Lone Star Republic of Texas, and the words California Republic at the bottom. From then on, the independence movement was known as the Bear Flag Revolt. The capture of Santa Fe was on August 15, 1846. The United States Army General Stephen Kearny had moved southwest from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, with about 1,700 men in his Army of the West. Kearny's orders were to secure the New Mexico territory in Alta California. August 9th in Santa Fe, Governor Manuel Armijo wanted to avoid battle, but Catholic priest Diego Archuleta and the young militia officers Manuel Chavez and Miguel Pino forced him to muster a defense. Armijo set up position in Apache Canyon, a narrow pass about 10 miles southeast of the city. However, on August 14th, before the American army was even in view, he decided not to fight. Kearny and his troops encountered no Mexican forces when they arrived on August 15th. After 6 straight weeks of marching through the desert, Kearny and his forces entered Santa Fe and claimed New Mexico territory for the United States without a single shot being fired. Some Americans were actually on the Mexican side of the war, such as St. Patrick's Battalion. It was a Mexican army unit which fought against the United States. It was made up of several hundred mostly Irish and other Catholic European immigrants, including numerous men who had deserted the United States Army. The battalion was formed and led by Irishman John Riley. It is believed the primary motivations were shared religions between the groups and also sympathy for the Mexican cause, based on the similarities between the situation in Mexico and Ireland. Even some African Americans made contributions to the war as well. Jacob Dodson may be the most well-known of the black men who participated in the Mexican War. Dodson rode west of John C. Fremont well before the war. In 1846, Dodson, Fremont, and another man rode an 800-mile journey to warn U.S. troops of a possible attack. In January 1847, the U.S. appointed territorial governor of New Mexico was assassinated at his house by Hispano native forces fighting the U.S. occupation. As the governor's enslaved servant, Green volunteered to join the pursuit. He fought and was wounded at the Battle of El Embudo. For his service, Green and his wife were freed by the governor's brother. On the morning of January 19, 1847, the Taos Revolt began. They were led by Pablo Montoya and Tomas Romero, and some other leaders as well. Romero led a Native American force to the house of Governor Charles Bent, where they broke the door down, shot Bent with arrows, and scalped him in front of his family. After they moved on, Bent was still alive. With his wife Ignacia and children, and the wives of friends Kit Carson and Thomas Boggs, the group escaped by digging through the adobe walls of their house into the one next door. They killed Bent, but the women and children were left unharmed. The next day, a large armed force of about 500 Hispanos and Puebloans attacked and laid siege to Simon Turley's mill and distillery in Arroyo Hondo, several miles north of Taos. Charles Autobes, an employee at the mill, saw the men coming. He rode to Santa Fe for help from the occupying U.S. forces. 8 to 10 mountain men were left at the mill for defense. After a day-long battle, only 2 mountain men, John David Albert and Thomas Tate Tobin, survived. Both escaped separately on foot during the night. Colonel Price led more than 300 U.S. troops from Santa Fe to Taos, together with 65 volunteers, including a few New Mexicans, organized by Saron St. Vrain, the business partners of brothers William and Charles Bent. Along the way, the combined forces beat back a force of about 1,500 Hispanos and Puebloans at Santa Cruz de la Canada and Embudo Pass. The rebels then retreated to Taos Pueblo, where they took refuge in a thick wall adobe church. During the ensuing battle, the U.S. breached the wall of the church and directed cannon fire into the interior, inflicting many casualties and killing about 150 rebels. They captured 400 more men after close hand-to-hand fighting. 7 U.S. troops died in the battle. Tomas Romero was shot in prison by John Fitzgerald before having a trial. Montoya was captured during the 1847 revolt. After the U.S. had re-established control, a military court charged him and convicted him of treason. The judges sentenced him and 14 other men to death for their roles in the revolt. Montoya and others were hanged in the Taos Plaza on February 7, 1847. Throughout the rest of 1847, there were a series of battles fought such as Monterrey, Buena Vista, and more, which all resulted in victories for the United States. On September 8, 1847, the siege of Mexico City began under General Winfield Scott. After capturing the port of Veracruz in March of that year, General Winfield Scott was able to secure a base and move inland. The main assault on the city came a few days later on September 12th. Mexico City was guarded in part by Chapultepec Castle, which was being used as a military academy. Scott did an infantry assault with an all-day artillery barrage on September 12th. Future Confederate generals George E. Pickett and James Longstreet, and also future Union General Ulysses S. Grant, participated in the attack. The Mexican forces eventually fell back from Chapultepec and retreated within the city. On September 14th, Mexico City was captured by U.S. forces. After this defeat, over the next few months, Mexico would be in peace negotiations, and a treaty was signed on February 2nd of 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The resulting treaty required Mexico to give 55% of its territory, including the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, and also a small portion of Wyoming. Mexico also relinquished all of its claims for Texas and recognized the Rio Grande as the southern boundary of Texas. It is amazing to see the depiction and effects of the Mexican-American War in the world of Red Dead. In Red Dead Revolver, which takes place in the 1880s, you can see a lot of characters that were probably involved in the Mexican-American War, such as General Diego, Colonel Darren, Sheriff Bartlett, and perhaps Buffalo. There were Americans like Colonel Darren, who fought on the Mexican side, such as St. Patrick's Battalion, and even some influences from African Americans like Buffalo, with men such as Jacob Dodson and Dick Green. In Red Dead Redemption, which takes place in 1911, we see more of the aftermath of the war, seen in locations such as Fort Mercer, Riley's Charge, El Presidio, and perhaps Torquemada. I would also say that Colonel Allende could be compared to Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Santa Anna ruled like a dictator, even giving himself the title of His Most Serene Highness. And as we've seen through both the game and real history, these type of dictators ultimately led to revolution, both in the game and the real Mexican Revolution of 1910.
It could be. This whole place is teeming with Americans on the run. Mercenaries, locals hell-bent on revolution.
Revolution? Another one?
Yeah. Never really ends. This whole place has been a hotbed for revolution since before the Spanish left. Colonel Allende, he runs this place like a feudal king. He's an awful individual.
The Mexican-American War had a great effect, not only in establishing most of the current-day borders, but also the expansion westward itself. It was from the result of this war that was a key component in the Manifest Destiny concept, which had changes and consequences, both for those going west, and for those who already inhabited the area as well. And that is it for this episode of Red Dead History. This was very interesting. Some of the things I knew about, some of the things I didn't. Like, I didn't know about the whole St. Patrick's Battalion. I didn't know about the African Americans who contributed. And it was kind of crazy to see the similarities between Santa Anna and Colonel Allende. So I'm wondering if Rockstar took influence from that. They might have, but I would say they might have. They're pretty smart when it comes to like certain history and film elements. But yeah, so and it's crazy to see like how many people who would be in the Civil War were in this war and who become future presidents. Like, you had two future presidents that fought in this war, and I don't know. Oh, there might even be more, but yeah, 2 future presidents who fought in this war: Zachary Taylor and Ulysses S. Grant. And even seeing the opinions of certain other ones like Abraham Lincoln who were against the war. So, and then another interesting thing is that I actually have a personal connection to the Mexican-American War. So by doing genealogy, and I encourage all of you, if you are interested in history or anything, do your family's genealogy, because in my opinion it helps make it like feel more alive to see like what events and things that your family was a part of. So Pablo Montoya, as I mentioned in the Taos Revolt part, he was my 5th great-grandfather. So from my mother's side, her dad. So through that line, he's my 5th great-grandfather. And so it was like really interesting. Like when I found that out, I was like, oh my gosh, like he was a part of that. And then even like further on, further back in that line, like there's people who were in the Pueblo Revolt. Like some people were in that. And that, I'll briefly talk about that. So the Pueblo Revolt was when all the Pueblo tribes and a few other tribes, I think, I may get it wrong, a few tribes that were not one of the Pueblos joined. Like I think maybe the Apaches as well, maybe Navajo, joined the Pueblo in kicking the Spanish out of New Mexico. They kicked them out for like 12 years. And I think that one, Bighorn, and then I think another one is where like, the natives just like won, But yeah, so anyway, Pablo Montoya was my 5th great-grandfather. And, in all accounts, a lot of them, say that, he was Hispano or whatever. But me and, a few of my other family members, we think that more likely he was, he either was a full-on Genízaro or he was a mixed Genízaro, like with Spanish, because he's from Abiquiu, and Abiquiu was like a big Genízaro settlement. Now, throwing this word around, Genízaro, like what does that mean? So another brief, I'm going on a tangent, another brief thing. So the Genízaros are basically detribalized Indians. So these were Indians that were taken not always, but most of the time by the Comanche. So these were either like Pawnee, Apache, Navajo as well, and like taken and sold to Spanish families. But there also were some Comanche that were taken captive too. They weren't the only ones that were taking people. It was a common thing to do. Like they would usually like take the women and children and trade, and sell them to Spanish families in exchange for things. And so the Genízaros are those people, because I believe at that time it was basically like a form of slavery, but it was more or less it was kind of like indentured servants. So like they would, serve, with the family for a lot of times, and usually they would intermarry within the family and have kids and kind of blend into the family. So there's a good population of the people of New Mexico that, have this Genízaro blood in them. Like, but it's like a, basically like detribalized Indians. So Abiquiu was a big settlement. I think there's also a few more that were, settlements, because they had nowhere to go. Like once they were detribalized, like they didn't know where their tribe was, because the tribes were, were always moving. So they didn't know how to like find their tribe or anything, or sometimes the tribe wouldn't take them back. But yeah, so they had nowhere to go, so they formed their own settlements, and Abiquiu was one of those settlements. And so that's why we think that he was either a full-on Genízaro or he was a Genízaro Spanish mix. And yeah, so it was really interesting. There's no pictures of him. He actually died in his 30s, which is like nuts to think of. Like, that's pretty young. I mean, I guess back then 30s was almost like middle age. But yeah, so he died in his 30s. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any pictures of him. But I do have a picture of his granddaughter. So she is my great-great-great-grandmother, Juana Maria Montoya. And she also lived in the Taos area. She was actually pretty interesting herself. It seems like she was like a midwife and also a curandera. The literal translation like means like healer, but I don't think she was like a medicine like a medicine woman or a shaman or anything. I kind of more equate it to like a holistic kind of medical, medical person, because like she knew all kinds of like natural remedies and stuff, probably from like the Tewa side or from the native side there, and like she helped different people in the area around that, and she was like well known in the area, so she's pretty interesting too. So anyway, I just thought that I would share that I actually have a personal connection to the Mexican-American War, and it's just interesting. So like I said, definitely look into your genealogy. Some people are like, oh, I don't care, and oh, it's boring. Like, I think it really gives you more of appreciation for your family and for the history that they were involved in, because I guarantee you every family has an interesting story like that. So anyway, that's my soapbox for learning your genealogy. Anyway, I thought it was all pretty interesting doing the research for this video, and I hope you guys enjoy, and I'll see you next time.